If it all began here, why are they trying to deny it?
Before the first pyramid rose from Egyptian sand, before the first Greek philosopher wrote a single word, before Rome had walls, before any civilization you were ever taught in school had drawn its first breath, African people had already been alive on this earth for 270,000 years. 270,000. Let that number break something open in you. The oldest Homo sapiens fossils ever discovered sit in Jebel Irhoud, Morocco, dated to 300,000 years ago. The next oldest are from Omo Kibish, Ethiopia, at 195,000 years. Every single early human fossil, every bone, every skull, every footprint pressed into ancient African mud, predates anything found anywhere else on Earth by tens of thousands of years. And in those hundreds of thousands of years before anyone else existed, African people were not sitting around waiting for civilization to be invented somewhere else. They were inventing it. All of it. Every foundational human achievement. The first fire, the first tool, the first art, the first music, the first medicine, the first mathematics, the first spiritual practice, the first language, the first trade, the first governance. Every single first in the entire catalog of human achievement happened in Africa, by African people, before the rest of the world had a single human being standing on its soil. What you were taught in school was not history. It was a highlights reel with the first 250,000 years edited out. Tonight we put them back. Start with what it means to be first. Because the word gets thrown around loosely, and we are not being loose tonight. We are being precise. When scientists say Africa is the birthplace of humanity, they are not saying it poetically or metaphorically as some gesture toward Pan-African pride. They are saying it because every line of evidence, the fossil record, the genetic record, the archaeological record, the geological record, all of them, independently and unanimously, point at the same continent. The out of Africa theory, which is the scientific consensus on human origins, and has been the consensus for decades, holds that anatomically modern Homo sapiens originated in Africa, and that all non-African populations descend from a single migration out of Africa that occurred between 50,000 and 70,000 years ago. Not an opinion, not a school of thought. The consensus, supported by ancient DNA analysis, mitochondrial DNA tracing, Y chromosome phylogenetics, fossil morphology, and the distribution of genetic diversity across the global human population. Africa contains more genetic diversity within its borders than the rest of the world combined. That is the genetic signature of origin. That is what it looks like in the NAR record when all human diversity starts from one place and then a subset of it disperses outward. The source is more diverse than the derivatives. Africa is more genetically diverse than Europe, Asia, the Americas, and Australia put together. Because Africa is where all those lineages started, and all those other populations are just branches that grew from the African root. The tools came first, and the tools came from Africa. The oldest stone tools ever found anywhere on Earth are the Oldowan tools from the Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, dated to approximately 2.6 million years ago. These were made by early hominins, human ancestors, not yet Homo sapiens, but the African lineage that would eventually produce Homo sapiens. These tools, sharp-edged stone flakes produced by striking one rock against another with controlled force, represent the earliest evidence of deliberate technological manufacture anywhere in the evolutionary record. The skill required to produce them, identifying appropriate stone, understanding the mechanics of fracture, applying controlled force at the correct angle to produce a functional edge. Is not random. It is learned, transmitted, and improved across generations. It is technology. African technology produced by African beings 2,006 million years ago. By the time Homo sapiens appeared, the stone tool tradition in Africa had been developing and improving for over 2 million years. The Acheulean hand axes that appear in the African record around 7 million years ago are objects of genuine craft, symmetrical, intentionally shaped, requiring planning and motor control that archaeologists have argued is evidence of complex cognitive function. The Middle Stone Age tools of southern Africa, produced between 280,000 and 25,000 years ago, include projectile points, blade tools, and composite implements that demonstrate a level of technological sophistication that was not achieved in Europe or Asia until tens of thousands of years later. The whole world learned to make tools from the African tradition. There was no other tradition. It started here. It developed here. For the first 2 million years of tool-making history, Africa was the only workshop in operation. Fire is the technology that changed everything. The achievement that separated the trajectory of human development from every other species on Earth. The ability to control fire, to carry it, to maintain it, to use it for cooking, warmth, protection, and eventually for manufacturing processes is foundational to the human story in a way that nothing else is. And fire control was an African achievement. The oldest evidence of controlled fire use by human ancestors comes from Africa. Wonderwork Cave in the northern Cape of South Africa has produced evidence of fire use dating to approximately 1 million years ago, including burned bone and plant ash in contexts that suggest intentional fire control rather than accidental exposure to natural fire. Research published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences documented this evidence in 2012. A 2025 study examining the earliest fire evidence across 9 sites worldwide found that 6 of the 9 were in Africa, with dates ranging from 800,000 to 1,800,000 years ago. The earliest evidence of fire outside Africa is younger. Africa tamed fire first. When Homo sapiens eventually walked out of Africa into the rest of the world 50 to 70,000 years ago, they carried fire-making knowledge with them, distributing the technology to a world that had not independently developed it at the same level. Every campfire, every hearth, every furnace, every engine, every power plant on Earth is a descendant of a fire that African hands first controlled in a cave in South Africa 1 million years ago. Blombos Cave on the southern coast of South Africa is the site that, more than any other archaeological discovery in the past 30 years, demolished the narrative that behaviorally modern humans with cognitive sophistication emerged in Europe. Before Blombos, the academic story was that the behavioral revolution, the explosion of symbolic thinking, art, complex tool-making, and cultural behavior that distinguishes modern human cognition from earlier forms, happened around 40,000 years ago in Europe. The cave paintings of Lascaux in France, Altamira in Spain, the carved figurines of Germany, these were treated as the origin of human symbolic thought. Then, Christopher Hinchelwood began excavating Blombos Cave and kept pulling out evidence that demolished that story year by year. Engraved ochre pieces, geometric patterns, deliberately scored into iron-rich stone, dated to 75,000 years ago. Perforated shell beads, made with enough consistency to be identified as personal ornaments, dated to 75,000 years ago. An ochre processing workshop with abalone shells used as mixing containers, grinding stones, charcoal, and bone, representing the first known paint, making kit in human history, dated to 100,000 years ago. a hashtag-like crosshatch pattern etched into a fragment of Silkrete rock, published in Nature in 2018 and described as the oldest known drawing, dated to 3,000 years ago. Every single one of these finds predates the European behavioral revolution by 30,000 to 60,000 years. The behavioral revolution did not happen in Europe. It happened in Africa. Symbolic thought, art, personal decoration, pigment production, geometric design, all of it began in Africa and was carried to Europe by the African people who migrated there, not invented by Europeans independently. Lascaux is not the beginning. Blombos is the beginning. And Blombos is in South Africa. Music came from Africa, and the evidence is sitting in a cave in South Africa right now. Musical instruments made from vulture bones have been found at Blombos Cave on the Cape Coast, dated to approximately 70,000 years ago, making them among the oldest known musical instruments in the world. The Lubombo bone, found in the Lubombo Mountains on the border of Swaziland and South Africa, is a baboon fibula with 29 deliberate notches, dated to approximately 43,000 years ago, possibly the oldest known mathematical and musical object on Earth, used either as a counting device, a lunar calendar, or a flute. The Ashongo bone from the Democratic Republic of Congo, dated to 25,000 years ago, also bears mathematical notching patterns that scholars have interpreted as evidence of arithmetic understanding, including prime numbers. These are not occasional finds from isolated sites. They are part of a consistent pattern in which the African archaeological record produces the oldest examples of musical, artistic, and mathematical activity. A pattern so consistent that it is no longer possible to argue it is coincidental. Africa produced the first musicians, the first artists, and the first mathematicians as separate categories of achievement that were actually a single integrated form of human cognitive expression. All of it happening in Africa, while the rest of the world was empty of human beings. The first religion. This is the one that requires the most careful handling, because religion is the category of human experience that everyone fights over, and the category whose origins are most systematically misrepresented in Western cultural discourse. When Christians in Europe claim that their faith traces to the Middle East, they are telling a partial truth that omits the African spiritual foundations beneath it. When Western secular culture treats African spiritual traditions as primitive precursors to real religion, it is inverting the actual historical relationship. The evidence for the oldest human spiritual practices comes from Africa. Burial with grave goods, the practice of placing objects in the ground with the dead in ways that imply belief in an afterlife or spirit world, is one of the primary archaeological markers of religious practice. The oldest known evidence of deliberate burial with grave goods in Africa includes sites dated to over 70,000 years ago. The oldest known ritual site in the world is not in the Middle East or Europe. It is the Python Cave in the Sodilo Hills of Botswana, a remote site where archaeologist Sheila Coulson in 2006 found a 6-meter-long rock carved to resemble a python, accompanied by hundreds of specially crafted spear points that showed signs of having been intentionally broken and discarded in the cave, dating to approximately 70,000 years ago. The San people of southern Africa, who are among the oldest continuously existing human populations on Earth, and who have maintained their cultural and spiritual practices across a span of time that makes any other religious tradition look recent, identified a python as a sacred figure in their spiritual cosmology. Coulson's interpretation, supported by subsequent analysis, is that this was a site of ritual practice, a place where African people gathered 70,000 years ago to perform ceremonies involving a sacred carved figure. This is not proto-religion. This is religion. Intentional, organized, symbolic, carried out in a dedicated sacred space with crafted objects. 70,000 years ago in Africa. The use of ochre, the red iron oxide pigment, that African people were mining, processing, and using from at least 100,000 years ago is another window into the earliest African spiritual life. Ochre has been found in African burial sites, on human remains, in tool-making contexts, and in the Blombos ochre processing workshop. In many African spiritual traditions, red ochre is associated with blood, life force, spiritual power, and ritual transformation. The consistent and widespread use of ochre across multiple African archaeological sites spanning hundreds of thousands of years suggests it was carrying symbolic meaning throughout the long span of African prehistory. The earliest cosmetics, the earliest ritual pigments, the earliest symbolic use of color, all of it traces to African ochre use that predates any comparable practice anywhere else by tens of thousands of years. When you see African women today using ochre in ceremonial contexts, when you see the Himba women of Namibia coating themselves in a mixture of ochre and animal fat, you are watching a practice whose roots go back to the dawn of symbolic human behavior. No other living tradition can claim that antiquity. None. The San people of Southern Africa deserve their own moment here because they are the living link to the oldest human culture on Earth, and what their existence reveals about African priority in every dimension of human achievement is staggering. Genetic studies consistently show that the San, also called the Bushmen or Khoisan, carry the oldest genetic lineages in the human species. Their mtDNA and Y chromosome lineages branch off closest to the root of the human genetic tree. They are, in the genetic sense, the oldest surviving human population. The click languages spoken by the San, including Ta and Juhon, are among the most phonologically complex languages on Earth, with click consonants that linguists believe may represent the oldest surviving sounds in human speech. The linguistic diversity of Africa in general is extraordinary. Africa contains roughly 2,000 distinct languages, more than any other continent by far, which is again the signature of origin. When all languages on Earth descend from a single geographic source, that source will have the most diversity, and Africa has the most linguistic diversity. The oldest languages on Earth are African languages. The first words ever spoken by a human being were spoken in Africa. The first medicine came from Africa. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, an ancient Egyptian medical text, dated to approximately 1600 BC, but believed to be copied from an original that is significantly older, describes surgical procedures, anatomical observations, and medical treatments with a clinical rationality that shocked scholars when it was first translated. But Egyptian medicine is far from the beginning of African medical knowledge. The Nubian populations of ancient Sudan had medical practices documented in archaeological sites, including Kerma, where human remains show evidence of surgical procedures, including trepanation, the deliberate drilling or scraping of holes in the skull, apparently performed on living patients who survived the procedure. Plant-based medicine, drawing on the extraordinary pharmacological diversity of African flora, was being practiced across the continent for tens of thousands of years before any other population had access to the medical knowledge. The World Health Organization estimates that between 70 and 80% of the African population still use traditional herbal medicine as their primary health care. And modern pharmacological research has repeatedly found that traditional African plant medicines contain active compounds that are genuinely effective for the conditions they have been used to treat. The traditional African medical knowledge that Western pharmaceutical companies have been mining and in some cases appropriating for commercial development represents the accumulated pharmaceutical wisdom of the oldest medical tradition on Earth, developed over hundreds of thousands of years by people who had the most time and the most incentive to understand the healing properties of the plants around them. The first doctor was African. The first pharmacist was African. The first surgeon who drilled a hole in a human skull and watched the patient walk away was African. The oldest astronomical observatories on Earth are in Africa. The Nabta Playa site in the Nubian desert of southern Egypt, discovered by archaeologist Fred Windorf in the 1970s and extensively studied since, contains a circular arrangement of standing stones dated to approximately 7,000 years ago, making it several centuries older than Stonehenge. The stone circle at Nabta Playa is aligned with the summer solstice sunrise and with certain bright stars, including Sirius, Dubhe, and others. The people who built it were African cattle herders, living in what was then a seasonal lake region in the Sahara, and they were tracking celestial events with sufficient precision to construct a megalithic monument aligned to them. 7,000 years ago in Africa, before Egypt was Egypt, before the pyramids, before any written astronomical record in Mesopotamia or Greece. The astronomical tradition of ancient Egypt, which produced the sophisticated calendar that underpins the Western calendar we use today, grew from this older African tradition of skywatching. The 365-day solar calendar was first developed in ancient Egypt, built on the foundation of African astronomical observation that preceded Egypt by thousands of years. The Sirius rising, which the Egyptians used to predict the annual Nile flood, was being tracked by African skywatchers in the Sahara before the Egyptians built their first monument. When Hipparchus and later Greek astronomers made contributions to astronomy that Western history celebrates, they were building on Egyptian astronomical knowledge. Egyptian astronomical knowledge was built on a foundation of African sky watching practice that goes back to the Stone Age. The telescope came from Europe. The observation it refined came from Africa. The Great Rift Valley of East Africa is the geographic spine of human history, and understanding why it matters is understanding why Africa could not have been anything other than the birthplace of humanity. The Rift Valley is a tectonic feature running roughly 4,000 miles from the Afar Triangle in Ethiopia south through Tanzania and into Mozambique, created by the separation of the African and Somali tectonic plates. The geological process of rifting produces dramatic topography, highlands and lowlands, lakes and rivers, volcanic soils of extraordinary fertility, and a diversity of ecological niches packed into a relatively compact geographic zone. For millions of years, the hominins of East Africa lived in a landscape that presented them with extraordinary environmental challenges and extraordinary resources simultaneously, a combination that evolutionary biologists and paleoanthropologists have argued created the selective pressures that drove the development of larger brains, more sophisticated social organization, and more complex cognitive abilities. The Rift Valley was a natural laboratory for human evolution, providing the environmental dynamism that drove cognitive development, the resources that supported population growth, and the geographic connectivity that allowed innovations to spread. No other region on Earth had this combination of factors operating across the millions of years required to produce Homo sapiens. Africa did not become the birthplace of humanity by accident. It was the only place with the right conditions, and it had them for long enough to produce the species. The first trade happened in Africa. Archaeological evidence of long-distance exchange of materials in Africa, specifically the movement of shells and obsidian across hundreds of miles beyond their geographic source, goes back at least 200,000 years. Shell ornaments found at Blombos Cave and at Oued Jebana in Algeria were sourced from coastlines of rivers, far from the find sites, indicating that these objects were being moved across large distances through exchange networks of some kind. The movement of obsidian, the volcanic glass prized for its exceptional sharpness in tool making, from its geological sources to sites where it appears archaeologically, shows that African populations were connected across considerable distances by systems of exchange and contact. By the time of the Middle Stone Age, evidence of trade networks connecting populations across the African continent is substantial. Long before the Silk Road, long before Phoenician maritime trade, long before any exchange network that European history books have heard of, African people were moving goods across distances that required either personal travel or the kind of gift exchange and trading relationships between communities that constitute the fundamental structure of economic activity. The first economy was African. It was not a money economy or a market economy, but it was an economy, a system of exchange relationships that moved valued goods across geographic distances and connected communities across the continent in webs of mutual dependency and collaboration. Language itself, the defining human capability that underlies every other achievement, the technology without which no knowledge can be transmitted across time and space, was invented in Africa. The origin of language is one of the most contested questions in all of science, and the direct evidence is necessarily limited because language does not fossilize the way bones and tools do. But the indirect evidence for the African origin of language is compelling from multiple directions. The Homo sapiens brain, with its language-enabling structures including Broca's area and Wernicke's area, evolved in Africa. The anatomical features necessary for the complex vocalizations of speech, including the descended larynx and the hyoid bone configuration that allows the full range of human sounds, were present in early African Homo sapiens. The extraordinary phonological complexity of the San-Click languages, which linguists believe may preserve the oldest phonological features of early human speech, is an African phenomenon. The linguistic diversity of Africa, far greater than any other continent, is the signature of origin in language just as it is in genetics. And the research program on the earliest symbolic behavior, including the Blombos ochre pieces and shell beads, is directly relevant to language origins because the capacity for symbolic representation that those objects demonstrate, the ability to treat a physical object as standing for something beyond itself, is the same cognitive capacity that underlies language. The African people who were making geometric patterns on ochre and wearing perforated shell beads 75,000 years ago were already thinking symbolically. The cognitive infrastructure for language was already in place. The first architecture, the first deliberate construction of built environments for human occupation, is also African. Evidence of intentional shelter construction, the modification of natural spaces into built environments, appears in the African archaeological record well before anything comparable is found elsewhere. McDougall hut structures in South Africa, the world's oldest known man-made structures, show evidence of grass bedding and intentional spatial organization. But more significantly, the megalithic tradition, the construction of large stone monuments for purposes that clearly transcend simple shelter, appears to begin in Africa, at Nabta Playa, and spreads outward. The monumental architecture of ancient Egypt, which includes the oldest large-scale stone buildings in the world, the step pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara, dated to approximately 2670 BC, and the Great Pyramid of Giza, dated to approximately 2560 BC, represents the culmination of an African architectural tradition that had been developing for thousands of years. When the pyramids were being built, they were already the oldest large-scale stone construction on Earth. When the Greeks and Romans visited Egypt and marveled at the pyramids, the monuments they were marveling at were already 2,000 years old. They were looking at ancient history. And the ancient history they were looking at was African. The pyramids themselves require a dedicated examination because they are the most physically overwhelming evidence of African intellectual and engineering supremacy in the ancient world, and their dimensions and construction continue to generate both wonder and controversy. The Great Pyramid of Giza stands at approximately 138 meters tall today, reduced from its original height of about 146 meters by the removal of its outer casing stones over the centuries. It was the tallest structure on Earth for approximately 3,800 years, from its construction around 2560 BC until the Lincoln Cathedral in England surpassed it around 1311 AD. 3,800 years as the tallest building on Earth. The engineering precision of the Great Pyramid is extraordinary by any measure. The base is leveled to within 2.1 centimeters across its entire 230-meter side length. The four sides are oriented to the cardinal directions with an accuracy of less than 4 minutes of arc. The structure contains approximately 2.3 million stone blocks, averaging 5 tons each, with the largest blocks in the internal chambers reaching up to 80 tons. The quarrying, transportation, and precision placement of these blocks, in an era before steel, before cranes, before any mechanized lifting equipment, represents a feat of organized labor, logistics, mathematics, and engineering that modern scholars are still working to fully understand. The Great Pyramid was built by African people, designed by African architects, organized by African administrators, and constructed by African workers in a country that is part of Africa. The greatest engineering achievement of the ancient world, by any metric, was African. The intellectual foundation of Egyptian civilization, the mathematics, astronomy, medicine, architecture, and administrative systems that made the pyramids possible did not spring into existence with the first dynasty around 3100 BC. It had been developing for thousands of years before that. The Neolithic African cultures of the Sahara, which occupied a then green and habitable Saharan region from approximately 10,000 to 5,000 years ago, were already practicing agriculture, animal husbandry, and constructing megalithic monuments before the Egyptian civilization coalesced in the Nile Valley. The African populations of the Sahara and the Nile corridor were developing the cognitive and cultural toolkit that would eventually produce Egyptian civilization across thousands of years of accumulated innovation. Egypt was not an anomaly. It was the product of a long African intellectual tradition that had been building since the Stone Age. The same tradition that produced the Blombos engravings and the Lubombo bone and the Naphtha Playa astronomers. Egypt is the concentrated, monumental expression of what happens when an African intellectual tradition has enough time and enough resources to fully develop. The Imhotep story is the piece that should be in every history curriculum, but never is. Imhotep was an African man who lived around 2650 BC in ancient Egypt, serving under Pharaoh Djoser of the Third Dynasty. His titles, recorded on the base of a statue found at Saqqara, include Chancellor of the King of Lower Egypt, first after the King of Upper Egypt, Administrator of the Great Palace, Hereditary Nobleman, High Priest of Heliopolis, Builder, Chief Carpenter, Chief Sculptor, and Maker of Vases in Chief. He is credited with designing the Step Pyramid of Saqqara, the first large-scale stone structure in history, making him the world's first named architect. He was also a physician, and his medical writings, which circulated in ancient Egypt, were so influential that he was deified as a god of medicine within a century of his death. The ancient Greeks, when they encountered the Egyptian deity of medicine, who was originally Imhotep, identified him with their own god of medicine. Asclepius, the man who inspired the Greek god of medicine, was an African. The Hippocratic oath that modern doctors take, which traces to the Greek tradition, traces through that tradition to the Egyptian medical knowledge that the Greeks learned from, which traces to the work of African physicians, including Imhotep, who was already practicing medicine and designing revolutionary architecture 2,600 years before the birth of Christ. When Western medical history celebrates Hippocrates as the father of medicine. It is celebrating a man who came over 1,000 years after an African man had already been deified for his medical achievements. The Egyptian Book of the Dead, properly known as the Book of Coming Forth by Day, is a collection of magical and religious texts whose purpose was to guide the deceased through the afterlife. The oldest versions of these texts, inscribed on the walls of the 5th and 6th dynasty pyramids around 2400 to 2300 BC, as what are called the pyramid texts, represent the oldest known religious writings on earth. Not the oldest religious practices, as we have established those go back to Blombos and the Python Cave, but the oldest surviving, written, religious literature. The first time human beings committed their theology to a medium that could survive across millennia is African. The theology encoded in the pyramid texts, the cosmology, the understanding of death and rebirth, the hierarchy of divine beings, the rituals of transformation, is a fully developed African theological system that had clearly been developing in oral tradition for a long time before it was inscribed on pyramid walls. The Egyptian theological tradition feeds into every subsequent religious tradition in the region. The Osiris-Isis horror story, the Egyptian narrative of divine death, resurrection, and divine kingship, has structural parallels to the Christian narrative that have been noted by scholars for over a century. The theological vocabulary of the entire Abrahamic tradition, including concepts of divine judgment, afterlife, spiritual transformation, and the relationship between the human and divine, was being articulated in Africa thousands of years before the Hebrew Bible was written. The first theologians were African. The first religious scholars were African. The first written theology was African. The Kemetic philosophical tradition, which is the intellectual tradition of ancient Egypt, is the direct ancestor of Greek philosophy. And Greek philosophy is the direct ancestor of Western philosophical and scientific thought. This is not a controversial claim. It is documented in the writings of Greek philosophers themselves. Pythagoras, whose name is attached to the theorem every student learns in geometry class, studied in Egypt for 22 years according to ancient sources. Thales of Miletus, often called the first Greek philosopher, is reported to have studied in Egypt. Plato studied in Egypt and incorporates Egyptian concepts throughout his dialogues. Aristotle's library reportedly included a significant body of Egyptian learning. The debt of Greek philosophy to Egyptian African intellectual tradition was openly acknowledged in the ancient world. It was only after the European Renaissance, when Greece was being elevated as the pure origin of Western civilization, and Egypt was being racially reclassified from an African civilization to a mysterious ancient civilization of uncertain or implicitly non-African character, that this acknowledged debt was minimized and eventually erased from the popular narrative. What happened was not that the history changed. The history did not change. What changed was who was allowed to claim credit for Africa's intellectual contribution to the civilization that followed it. The Greeks gave credit to Egypt. European historians took it away. The philosophical schools of Alexandria, which we discussed in the Anglicanism video in this series, represent another dimension of African intellectual primacy in the ancient world. Alexandria, founded by Alexander the Great in 331 BC on the Egyptian coast, became the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean world in large part because it was built in Africa, drawing on the 3,000-year tradition of Egyptian learning and on the African populations of scholars and thinkers who inhabited and contributed to it. The Library of Alexandria, the greatest collection of human knowledge in the ancient world, was an African institution. It was in Africa. It was funded by the rulers of African Egypt. It was built on an African city's streets. The scholars who worked there came from across the known world, but the institution that housed and supported them was African. When the Library of Alexandria is held up as a symbol of human intellectual aspiration, of the desire to gather and preserve all human knowledge, it is an African institution being celebrated, generally without anyone mentioning that it was in Africa. The agricultural revolution, the transition from hunting and gathering to food production that enabled the development of settled civilizations, has African dimensions that the standard narrative completely obscures. The teaching most people received is that agriculture was invented in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, in the so-called cradle of civilization in Mesopotamia, around 10,000 years ago. This is partially true, but fundamentally misleading. African agriculture developed independently and possibly earlier in some areas. The domestication of sorghum, one of the world's most important grain crops and still a staple food for hundreds of millions of people, happened in the Sahel region of Africa, probably between 8,000 and 10,000 years ago. The domestication of pearl millet, finger millet, teff, and insate all happened in Africa independently of the Fertile Crescent. The cultivation of coffee originated in Ethiopia, where the wild coffee plant Coffea arabica is indigenous, and where human beings were harvesting and eventually cultivating it long before it was introduced to the Arabian Peninsula and eventually to the world. The agriculture that feeds the world today draws on African domesticated crops that were developed independently by African farmers, working in parallel with the Fertile Crescent development of wheat and barley. The global food system is partly built on African agricultural innovation. The morning coffee that half the world drinks started as an Ethiopian plant that Ethiopian people first learned to use. The metallurgical tradition of Africa is another dimension of African technological primacy that the standard history conceals. The oldest known iron smelting sites in the world are in Africa. Iron smelting, the technology of extracting iron from ore using high-temperature furnaces, was independently invented in Africa. The African iron smelting tradition, centered in the Great Lakes region of East Africa and in West Africa, may predate iron smelting in the Middle East, and certainly developed independently. The Haya people of Tanzania were producing carbon steel in preheated forced draft furnaces around 2,000 years ago, using a technology that produced steel of a quality not achieved in Europe until the 19th century. This is documented in the archaeological and ethnographic literature. The Nok culture of what is now Nigeria, active between 1,500 and 2,000 years ago, produced sophisticated iron tools and tools alongside their famous terracotta sculpture tradition. The iron technology of sub-Saharan Africa enabled the Bantu expansion, the demographic and agricultural spread of Bantu-speaking peoples across sub-Saharan Africa over the last 3,000 years, which represents one of the largest human population movements in history. The African Iron Age was not a derivative of a Middle Eastern or European Iron Age. It was an independent invention by African metallurgists who had developed the chemistry of high-temperature combustion and metal reduction from first principles. The highest steelmakers of Tanzania were producing carbon steel in furnaces with technology that European industrial metallurgy would not match for another 18 centuries. The political structures of pre-colonial Africa were not the tribal chaos that colonial propaganda described. They were sophisticated systems of governance, law, and administration that managed large populations, regulated trade, maintained peace, and provided the institutional framework for complex civilizations to function. The Kingdom of Kush in Sudan, which at its height between 750 and 650 BC conquered and ruled Egypt as the 25th dynasty, was a black African empire administering one of the most complex and extensive states in the ancient world. The Mali Empire, at its 14th century peak under Mansa Musa, was the wealthiest state on earth, producing an estimated half of the world's gold supply and administering a territory larger than Western Europe. Mansa Musa's 1324 pilgrimage to Mecca, during which he traveled with 60,000 people and 12,000 enslaved people carrying 4 pounds of gold each, was so spectacular and his spending so lavish that he single-handedly caused gold price inflation across North Africa and the Middle East for over a decade. The Songhai Empire that succeeded Mali controlled the major trans-Saharan trade routes and included the city of Timbuktu, whose university, the Sankore Madrasa, was one of the great centers of learning in the medieval world, with a student population estimated at around 25,000 and a library of between 700,000 and 1 million manuscripts. 1 million manuscripts in Timbuktu, in West Africa, sitting in private collections and library collections in Mali right now, still being cataloged and digitized, covering mathematics, astronomy, medicine, law, theology, history, and philosophy. The greatest library of the medieval world was African. The Aksumite Empire of Ethiopia and Eritrea, which we have discussed in earlier videos in this series, in the context of the earliest African church and the earliest African coins, was one of the four great powers of the ancient world, alongside Rome, Persia, and China. It controlled Red Sea trade, minute gold coins, built towering obelisks whose engineering still challenges modern analysis, and developed the Ge'ez script, a writing system that is still in use today as the liturgical language of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. The Aksumite obelisks of Aksum, some of which stand over 30 meters tall and weigh hundreds of tons, are monolithic carved stone structures of extraordinary technical precision, erected without cranes, without steel cables, without any of the lifting equipment that modern engineers would consider necessary for such a task. The engineering methods used to quarry, transport, and erect these obelisks remain a subject of scholarly study. The largest of the Aksumite obelisks, which collapsed in antiquity, was the tallest single stone ever erected in the ancient world, surpassing even the Egyptian obelisks in dimensions. African engineering, African precision, African ambition in stone that lasted 2,000 years. Great Zimbabwe, the medieval stone city in southern Zimbabwe, is perhaps the most dramatic architectural refutation of the colonial myth that sub-Saharan Africa had no history of urban civilization before European contact. The walls of Great Zimbabwe, built between the 11th and 15th centuries, are constructed of granite blocks, fitted together without mortar, with such precision that the joints are nearly invisible. The main enclosure, called the Great Enclosure, has walls up to 11 meters high and 5 meters thick, enclosing an area of roughly 9,000 square meters. No mortar, no cement. Dry stone construction fitted with a precision that has not been matched in any subsequent African stone construction. The city at its peak housed an estimated 11,000 to 18,000 people, making it by far the largest pre-colonial city in sub-Saharan Africa. It was the political and religious capital of a trading empire that controlled the interior gold trade of southern Africa and had direct commercial connections with the East African Swahili coast cities that traded with Arabia, Persia, India, and China. Chinese pottery has been found at Great Zimbabwe. Persian glassware has been found there. The city was connected to the global medieval trade network. It was not isolated. It was not primitive. It was a major node in the economic network of the medieval world, built by the Shona people of southern Africa, administered by their kings, and connected by trade to civilizations across the Indian Ocean. When European settlers arrived in the region in the 19th century and found Great Zimbabwe, they refused to believe that African people had built it and began fabricating theories attributing it to Phoenicians, Arabs, and various non-African peoples. Every one of those theories has been comprehensively demolished by modern archaeology. The builders of Great Zimbabwe were the ancestors of the Shona people who live in Zimbabwe today, African people. Building a city without mortar with engineering precision that still impresses architects and structural engineers who study it. The oral traditions of Africa carry histories that are as long and as detailed as any written archive in the world, and they have been systematically undervalued because the Western scholarly tradition, which privileged written text, refused for centuries to take oral tradition seriously as a form of historical record. The griots of West Africa, the hereditary oral historians who maintain the genealogies, histories, and cultural memory of their communities, were trained over years to memorize and transmit historical accounts of extraordinary length and complexity. The Epic of Sandiata, the oral epic of the founder of the Mali Empire in the 13th century, is a narrative of comparable scope and literary quality to the Iliad or the Mahabharata, transmitted orally across 7 centuries before it was written down in the 20th century. The fact that it survived 7 centuries of oral transmission with sufficient consistency to be recognized as a coherent narrative by scholars is evidence of the reliability and sophistication of the griotic oral tradition as a mechanism for preserving historical knowledge. African civilizations that did not develop writing, or that developed writing systems not recognized by Western scholarship, were not therefore illiterate in any meaningful sense. They were operating with a different technology for knowledge storage and transmission, one that in some respects is more resilient than written archives, because it lives in human memory and human performance rather than in physical objects that can be burned or destroyed. The Library of Alexandria was destroyed. The oral traditions it might have recorded, had anyone thought to transcribe them, survived in the people who carried them. The Nsibidi writing system of the Ijikhan people of southeastern Nigeria and southwestern Cameroon is one of several African writing systems that developed independently of any external influence. Nsibidi uses geometric symbols to represent concepts and has been used for centuries in secret societies, on ceremonial objects, in tattoos, and in formal communication. It is not the only independent African writing system. The Vai script of Liberia, developed in the early 19th century by Mamadou Duwalu Bukele based on a dream he reported having, is a syllabic script that was adopted and used by the Vai people for written communication and record keeping. The Bamum script of Cameroon was developed by Sultan Njoya of the Bamum people in the late 19th century and has been continuously used and refined since then. The Ge'ez script of Ethiopia, which we have mentioned, is over 2,000 years old and still in active use. The ancient Meroitic script of the Kushite kingdom in Sudan, used from approximately the 3rd century BC to the 5th century AD, is still not fully deciphered, meaning there is a body of African written knowledge in an African script that modern scholars have not yet been able to read. Africa did not lack writing. It had multiple independent writing systems, some of which survived and are still in use, and one of which, the Proto-Sinaitic script developed in the Egyptian Sinai mines, is, as we established in an earlier video, the ancestor of every alphabet on Earth. The world learned to write from Africa and then told Africa it could not write. The first law. The Code of Hammurabi, the Babylonian legal code dated to approximately 1754 BC, is often cited in textbooks as the first written law in history. But Egyptian legal codes predate Hammurabi by centuries. The Egyptian legal tradition, documented in text from at least the Old Kingdom period around 2600 BC, includes detailed case law, procedural rules, and substantive legal principles, including provisions that modern scholars have noted anticipate concepts of due process, equality before the law, and social protection for vulnerable people. The Merikeri Papyrus, an ancient Egyptian instructional text dated to around 2100 BC, includes ethical and legal principles governing the conduct of rulers and the treatment of citizens that represent a sophisticated political and legal philosophy. The concept of Ma'at, the Egyptian principle of cosmic order, truth, justice, and balance that governed both natural and social reality, was the foundational concept of Egyptian law and of Egyptian moral philosophy. Every Egyptian legal proceeding was conducted under the ideal of Ma'at. Every ruler was judged by whether their governance embodied Ma'at. Every person's soul was judged after death by whether their life had been lived in accordance with Ma'at. This is not primitive morality. This is a sophisticated, unified theory of cosmic, social, and personal ethics that informed law, governance, and individual conduct simultaneously. The first systematic ethical and legal philosophy was African. The trans-Saharan trade networks that connected sub-Saharan Africa to North Africa, the Mediterranean, and the Middle East for thousands of years were among the most extensive and most consequential commercial systems in the pre-modern world. Gold, salt, ivory, enslaved people, cloth, and manufactured goods moved across the Saharan desert along routes maintained by African merchants, African guides, and African political authorities who taxed and protected the trade. The cities that grew up along these routes, including Timbuktu, Gao, Djenné, and Kumbi Saleh, were major urban centers with populations comparable to contemporary European cities, with active markets, religious institutions, scholarly communities, and cosmopolitan populations drawn from multiple ethnic and linguistic backgrounds. Timbuktu at its height in the 15th century had a population estimated at 100,000, making it larger than any city in England at that time. The gold that financed the medieval European economy came significantly from West Africa, moved north along the trans-Saharan routes, and entered the Mediterranean economy through North African ports. Medieval Europe's prosperity was partially underwritten by African gold. The first global trade networks ran through Africa. African merchants were the connective tissue of the pre-modern global economy. Now here's the part that everything else in this video has been building toward. Every human achievement that has ever been celebrated, every invention, every discovery, every cultural and intellectual and spiritual and technological first occurred on a timeline that begins in Africa. Not because of some cultural preference or ideological claim, but because of the simple arithmetic of chronology. Africa had human beings first. Africa had human beings only for the first 200,000 years of human existence. The things human beings do, thinking, creating, building, worshiping, trading, governing, healing, teaching, were happening in Africa for 200,000 years before they were happening anywhere else. 200,000 years. You cannot produce a list of human firsts that does not begin in Africa, because there is no human being outside Africa who is old enough to be first at anything. The first painter was African. The first musician was African. The first mathematician was African. The first astronomer was African. The first doctor was African. The first architect was African. The first philosopher was African. The first theologian was African. The first trader was African. The first governor was African. The first everything was African, because Africans were the only humans there were for the first 200,000 years of human history. The specific claim that African people were the first to develop religion deserves to be held open a moment longer, because it connects to something that the rest of this series has been building toward. We have, in the videos in this series, established that the oldest complete Bible is African, that Jesus' cross was carried by an African, that King Solomon was African, that God's physical description in the Bible matches African features, that the 10 Commandments were given in an African language, that the world's first church was built in Africa, that the greatest theologians of Christian history were African. And now we are establishing that religious practice itself, the very impulse to mark sacred space, perform ritual, use symbolic objects in spiritual contexts, and bury the dead with care that implies belief in something beyond material existence, first appeared in Africa. The Python Cave at 70,000 years ago. The ochre burials. The Blombos engravings that scholars interpret as having possible ritual significance. The entire arc of human spiritual development begins in Africa, runs through Africa for 200,000 years, and then spreads outward to every corner of the planet with the African people who migrated there. Every religion on earth is descended from African spirituality, not inspired by it, not parallel to it, descended from it, the way all human beings are descended from African ancestors. What happened to this knowledge? How did the species that came from Africa, built civilization in Africa, invented every fundamental human achievement in Africa, end up in a world where Africa is presented as the last place to develop and the first place to need saving? The answer is colonial historiography, the systematic rewriting of human history that accompanied European expansion from the 15th century onward. European colonialism did not just extract resources and labor from Africa. It extracted history. It took the narrative of African achievement, suppressed it, reclassified African civilizations as prehistoric or primitive, denied African intellectual contribution to every field of knowledge, reclassified Egyptian civilization as non-African, dismissed African writing systems, dismissed African philosophical traditions, dismissed African scientific achievement, and replaced the actual historical record with a story in which European civilization emerged from classical Greece and Rome, spread to the rest of the world through colonial enlightenment, and brought civilization to peoples who had not previously had it. Every piece of that story is false. Greece learned from Egypt. Egypt was African. Rome learned from Greece. The rest of the world's civilizations developed independently in parallel, not derived from European origins. Africa was not uncivilized when Europeans arrived. It was civilized thousands of years before Europe was. The African civilizations that Europeans encountered when they arrived were in many cases older than the European civilizations doing the encountering. The current generation is the first generation with the technological infrastructure to actually reverse this. Digital access to the academic literature that documents African achievement in every field means that the evidence is no longer locked in specialist journals accessible only to people with university affiliations. YouTube channels, podcasts, documentaries, and social media platforms mean that the information can reach people who were never taught it in school. The generation of African and diaspora scholars doing this work, people like Cheikh Anta Diop, who argued for African origins of Egyptian civilization before it was academically respectable to do so. People like Theophile Obenga, who developed the linguistic and cultural connections between ancient Egypt and sub-Saharan Africa. People like Ron Eglash, who documented African fractal mathematics and its connections to modern computing. People like Timnit Gebru, who is holding AI accountable to its African intellectual roots. These are people doing for the history of African achievement what the archaeologists at Blombos did for African prehistory. Excavating what was always there, brushing off the sediment of 500 years of willful concealment, and presenting the evidence in a form that the world can no longer ignore. Here is where it all lands. You are the descendant of the first humans, not metaphorically. Genetically, every human being alive today, without exception, is the descendant of African people who lived in Africa before anyone else existed anywhere. Your genetic ancestors, all of them, were African people who looked like African people, spoke African languages, practiced African spiritual traditions, made African art, used African tools, lived under African skies, and eventually walked out of Africa to populate a world that had been waiting, empty, for their arrival. The species did not begin in Europe and spread to Africa. It began in Africa and spread everywhere else. The achievements that humanity is most proud of, the ones that define what it means to be human, the ones that set our species apart from everything else that has ever lived on this planet, were first achieved by African people in Africa in the first 200,000 years of human history that the standard curriculum left out. The first fire, the first tool, the first artwork, the first music, the first mathematics, the first astronomy, the first religion, the first medicine, the first architecture, the first writing, the first law, the first philosophy, the first trade, the first civilization, all of it. Africa, all of it. First, every single time you have been impressed by human achievement, every time you have marveled at what our species can do, you have been marveling at the inheritance of a tradition that began in Africa, was developed for 200,000 years in Africa, and was given to the rest of the world by the African people who walked out of the continent they had been perfecting themselves in since the beginning of time. Africa did not receive civilization. Africa is civilization. It always has been. The evidence is in the ground. It is in the genes. It is in the artifacts. It is in the bones and the engravings and the tools and the astronomical alignments and the written texts and the oral traditions and the steel furnaces and the stone cities and the mathematical systems and the binary code running on the device you are using to watch this right now. Africa is first. Africa is original. Africa is the only reason any of the rest of this exists. And the only question worth asking now is how much longer are we going to let that be a secret?